As data engineers, we love comparing different tools. We like talking about technical things, but at the end of the day, our job boils down to delivering insights to a business so that it can make better decisions. With that high level perspective in mind, today's video, we're going to talk about one strategic thing you can add to your data pipeline if it doesn't already exist, and that is creating a presentation layer. This is something that I've covered in other videos, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about it today, more in terms of the value of it, the different approaches you can take, as well as considerations to keep in mind as you go about adding this to your own project. Now, before we talk about the value, let's just clarify what I'm talking about. In my mind, when I think about a presentation layer, it is the single final layer of a data pipeline for which everything outside of the database interacts with. So this could be individuals tapping into the database or reporting tools, connecting to build reports. This is a consolidated place for all of that to live. We're going to talk about the different ways to do this, but technically speaking, to me, this is either the database or the schemas and tables that are designed purposely for presentation. So with that in mind, let's now talk about the value of doing this at all. So number one is security. By establishing a specific place where anything outside of the data team can connect to, you can be very particular about permissions and isolating data in ways to avoid people from just seeing everything all at once. Some teams, when they're new, will just allow anybody access to the core data model, to the raw data, whatever it is, and kind of have free reign of what they want to look at. And this is understandable to an extent, but at some point, it's actually counterproductive and can be a security risk. So by creating these separate databases or schemas and aligning your security just for that and assigning people to these different security groups, you can be sure that you're taking care of your data. And overall, you just don't have systems or people having access to information that they don't need or maybe shouldn't be allowed to see in the first place. Similarly, having this layer also gives you more control as the data team in terms of what people can see, whether that comes down to specific columns or tables and whatnot, but also maybe some custom logic that is specific to one department compared to another. For example, the accounting team compared to the sales team might have slightly different definitions of things, or maybe you just want to format it differently at that final layer, depending on who's looking at it. It gives you more control to slightly tweak that depending on the audience. And most importantly, it allows you to do that without impacting the core data model sitting below it. So effectively, this presentation layer sits on top of your data model so that the data model itself doesn't get impacted, but the way you present it can be adjusted depending on who the audience is. So a final point on this is your data model under the hood, let's say it's a customer's dimension, could have a ton of different columns, but a lot of those are not necessary for certain user groups. Therefore, with this presentation layer, you can just pick specific columns that one group might need and give it in there, call it a schema or whatever. And then another group might get visibility to more columns or might have less of them available. So it just gives you as a team more control and allows a better experience for your end users because they're not going to be overwhelmed with things that they just don't need. The third point on this value is simplicity. And by this, I mean simplicity for the end users. It might be a little more work for us to organize this in the ways that we're talking about. As a user, when they go into their area of the presentation layer, everything is nicely set up for them. They see exactly what they need. Even something as simple as having space casing versus snake casing, or not having to think about joining together the underlying data model. They may not understand facts and dimensions, but you can just give them a nice clean table to work with. It makes their life a lot easier. So ultimately they can get the value that they're looking for, which is using this data to make decisions, to plug it into a report or to do whatever it is they need to do, not worry about the technical aspects of things, which is what we are there to do. We're there to help set that up and then serve it up to our business stakeholders so that they can take it and help run the business and we all win together. And I say all this to help put in perspective the value of this presentation layer. It's not just renaming a column. It's really about saving people time and making it as easy as possible for them to get the value and grow from this data. When I think about a presentation layer, it's typically part of a data pipeline or a data modeling approach. For me, it's usually the third level of a 3-layer data model, but it also touches on other parts of the architecture that are really going to impact the success of a team. With that comes a lot of responsibilities and things to think about to make sure you're covering all of the big ticket items. So whether you're somebody who is leading this type of implementation or you want to level up in your career to be able to contribute to those types of things, I have put together a completely free checklist called the Modern Data Checklist to help break down this whole process of building a data architecture into specific items, along with some other helpful information around it. So if that's something you're interested in, again, it's completely free. I think it will be really helpful for you, or at the very least, just help you get it all in front of you so you can be more successful going forward. With that said, let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about some of the common approaches that I see teams doing for this presentation layer. So the most common example that I see is just separating things by different schemas. For example, you you might have different business groups, different departments, accounting, operations, sales, whatever it is. Each of them could get their own individual schema within a database dedicated directly to them. So in each of those schemas, they might have specific tables served to them from the data model. They might have individual tables that are custom to them that other ones won't see. So it's a unique combination of things that you build for them and serve it up to them. And this approach also works well with the security concept because you can create security roles and groups of users that are all tied to permissions to that one schema. So everybody in this group gets access to this schema and it works really nicely together. Another approach I see for this is more report or deliverable based setup. So in this case, maybe you have individual tables or views for every single report that you have. Therefore, you know that as long as you connect to that, all the data in that table feeds directly to that report. There's less to do on the front end in terms of the report. It's more of just pulling the columns and picking the ones you want. You're not doing any more custom stuff. And while that does have a lot of benefits in the sense of you're owning the logic, you don't have that logic hidden in different reports. The downside is this can really start to muddy up this presentation layer very quickly and lead to a lot of tech debt where you might have built something specifically for a report, but then it becomes obsolete or you don't know if it's being used anymore. You ultimately just end up with a lot of different tables and code that you need to maintain at some level. To me, that's not the most sustainable approach, but I also understand the reasoning behind that. And I think a lot of this comes to context of the scope of the number of tables you have, the number of reports, things like that. So obviously keep that all in consideration. And now the last approach is a little bit of a hybrid that I'll just mention here where you could have individual, let's call it schemas for different business groups so that you're isolating things, but you also have a shared common, maybe call it a master schema or presentation mart with things that are shared across different departments. So rather than repeating the same thing in a bunch of different places, you create one common data mart in the presentation layer for which everybody has access to. Maybe it's a common customers table or locations or dates table, things like that, that everybody would need to use. And it's not really an issue of isolating things. So it does help eliminate some of the redundancy there and make it a little bit easier for everybody to be referring to the same things. The other part of this is finding this balance between creating things that are so specific to one report, that one-to-one concept, as well as creating things that are overly general to everything that requires more customization to fit a report. How do you find that middle ground? And to me, it's creating wide tables that are custom for specific concepts. So maybe it's a master order summary or something like that, that combines a lot of the concepts underneath. This allows you to strike a nice balance between having something that can be reused for multiple reports and deliverables, but also specific enough that it's focused around one concept. There's no single best answer, but that is part of the job of understanding the data, understanding the customer, in our case, our stakeholder needs, and delivering something that can work best. Now, the last part here, I want to talk about considerations when it comes to building this presentation layer, because it's one thing to talk about it, but what do you need to think about when you're building this for yourself? So number one is your stakeholder expectations. And by that, I mean, what's really needed. A lot of times giving too much information is overly confusing and just distracts from the point of what they're trying to do. So this is where understanding the needs of your stakeholders are really important. And it's not that you're trying to be difficult. It's that you're trying to give them only what they need so that they can get the job done. And then you add on as needed, because once it's out there, you never know what's going to happen with how people use data. And you start to lose that control and you start to get some conflicting information. So you really want to be deliberate about what people actually need. And so with the expectations, it's more about what are they expecting to get from this data? How can you help them get to that point as simply and efficiently as possible? So you build the different parts of the presentation layer around this idea. And along with this is understanding what are the shared concepts. Maybe that leads into your approach of having a shared schema of information compared to isolating everything, or maybe it's all in the other direction. What are the expectations of how the stakeholders plan to interact with this data? The other note I have here is not just stakeholders, but analysts. What are their expectations and really their skill set? And when I say analyst here, they may not necessarily have the title of an analyst, but they function that way. They're the ones who are using the data to write maybe additional custom queries, or they are creating the reports. They're interacting with this data, but they aren't necessarily the engineers building the pipeline. Should they be expected to understand relationships of a star schema, facts and dimensions and keys? Maybe the answer is yes, and therefore you present to them the facts and dimensions and allow them to use the model in their own way. Or maybe using the term fact and dimension is going to confuse people. So you're better off just creating more entity-focused smarts that'll be more useful for these analysts to use in whatever it is they're trying to build. I have noticed over the years some data teams sharing their facts and dimensions to the company and saying, all right, here you go build whatever reports, just use these facts and dimension tables, connect them together, and you can build whatever you want. And to us, that makes sense. It seems obvious, but for people who aren't in the data world, that is just confusing. And they're probably going around that without you really knowing. It has nothing to do with intelligence or the ability to understand it. It's more so, it's just not what they're used to. There are definitely things in other departments and other tools outside of our world of data that we would be totally confused by if people just threw it at us and expected us to use it. But yet we expect others to pick these things up without any background. So again, the whole point here is to be clear on the expectations of what your analysts, the people who are connected to this data, are going to be from a technical perspective in terms of your naming and strategy with how you present it. And the third point on considerations is management of your metrics. And one of the most common issues as a company grows with data is that you get the same metric with the same name returning different values on different reports. It could be something as seemingly simple as revenue. Revenue might be called revenue on 10 different reports, and you could get 10 different numbers. So how do you deal with that? I think a presentation layer really helps solve this, because you can define that in different ways for different departments and be very clear on what people are seeing for that number. In this case, let's call it revenue. But at the same time, it's really important to establish one clear definition for metrics that the whole company will use for universal reporting. You could have a verified column for revenue, that this definition is signed off and supported by the executive team of the company. This is what's used for company-wide reporting, and this is what it is. Now, you can have your own individual versions of revenue that might be a little more specific to your department or what you think, and you can run with that. But when it comes to sharing the company-wide revenue, this is what we're going to work on, and it's verified, and you can name it that way. Now, if you can avoid having the different numbers at all, obviously that's ideal, but in reality, that tends to happen. So having a verified set of metrics that the executive team signs off, whatever that means for you, is often a good approach and can often save you a lot of time of going back and forth trying to figure out what is the quote unquote right number. The other thing to consider here, or at least be mindful of, is the different places where you are establishing logic for things. And in particular with metrics, do you have it only in a fact table and on a certain granularity that you then aggregate later, which is what I would recommend. But sometimes you also need to add additional logic in the presentation layer. And if you are creating that in the presentation layer, how are you managing that? How many different places is this happening? Are there ways that you can consolidate it? Again, maybe you need to move it back to the fact table and reuse it. Maybe you need to create some macros or functions to help consolidate some of the logic so that you're not changing it in multiple places. Just keeping that in mind as your presentation layer grows, that the rest of your architecture doesn't lose its control and overall structure at the same time. A lot of this can be managed really well through having a good process. So version control, automated checks, documentation, those things, which are sometimes boring, but really important things to include in any data architecture for any data team. And hopefully this video is helping to explain that we do all these things not because we want to punish ourselves, but because we want to make sure we're delivering things to the business that help people make better decisions, that drive value and grow the business. So we have more things that we can build and more things to do, add more value, and it becomes a flywheel of helping the business grow, which helps our team grow, which helps the business grow. But we have to do all of this by doing things like creating a presentation layer, like creating a process and testing, documenting all that stuff. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of a presentation layer, and you can figure out if this is something you have today or maybe something you want to implement in your own project here in the near future. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.